Thanks, Steve.
Perfect. All right, you guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. This is actually a really great turnout, especially for 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's fantastic to see everybody here on this beautiful day. So this is the first speaker in the spring series of the Harrington Research Series. So we have Dr. Alan Diello, Jr. with us, and actually Professor Jeff Latham is going to be introducing him, his colleague. But before we get started, I did want to mention another event that's coming up March 23rd at 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock in Chafee 273. This is sponsored by the Library, Harrington School, Gender and Women's Studies, and the English Department, and it is related to this. It's going to be a great event. It's called Finding Reliable Information in a Post-Fact World, and it's a panel with speakers from English, the libraries, political science, journalism, and sociology and anthropology. So we hope you can all join us for that event as well. Again, that is March 23rd, 4 to 6 o'clock, and I'm sure you'll be getting emails about that as well. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Latham to formally introduce our speaker for this event.
Thank you, Vala. Alan Diello and I go back quite a long ways. We are actually gaming nerds together back at the turn of the century, which at this point now is a pretty long time ago. He graduated in 1999, the same year I joined University of Rhode Island. And I'm very happy to get the chance to introduce him, as we have kept in contact all these years, and I've got a chance to see his growing interest in communication and learn a little bit about his work in Great Britain. I think that it's really easy to lose perspective on how what a force for good the alternative media has been, because we're seeing so much of the dark side of the alternative media with some of the hateful things that comes out of the alt-right. But I remember for myself when I first came to Rhode Island how much I really appreciated and enjoyed the articles I'd see in the Providence Phoenix, and saying to myself, how come I'm not seeing any of this kind of stuff in the Projo or something like that? And so while we rush to judgment really quickly about how terrible the alternative media can be, in the year 2017. Then I think it's really good perspective to realize that it's not that alternative media is bad or that it's good. It's that it's powerful. It's unique, diverse voices coming from the media into our communities. It's places where people who cannot be heard otherwise get a chance to speak. And so I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Alan Diello and share with him his thoughts and his research on how the alternative media shapes the way that we live with each other.
Thanks. So, thank you for having me. I apologize if I'm a little bit nervous. It's been a little while since I've been up in front of an audience of this size, and also of this mix of both faculty, students, as well as the public. So I decided to frame, because of that, I decided to frame this lecture in a way that should hopefully be accessible to everybody who's going to be listening to it. It's a very current topic. It's also a topic that's very fraught. It's also almost impossible to talk about this topic of alternative media for alternative facts without talking about politics. Right now, the whole craft of journalism is being upended by both the pressures on one hand of alternative media, and on the other hand, by the delegitimization of the craft by our current president, I guess is the best way to put it. So we live in a sophisticated and advanced democracy here, both here and where I did my academic research in Great Britain and in the European Union. But we're living in very strange times. We're living in what many commentators are referring to as post-factual democracy. Feelings and emotions now are more important than facts, and content and perspective no longer seen as important versus how someone feels within their argument. As Nicholas Barrett pointed out immediately after the Brexit vote, in which Britain voted to leave the European Union back in June, he pointed out in the Financial Times that perhaps most significantly, we now live in a post-factual democracy. When the facts meet the myths, they were as useless as bullets bouncing off the bodies of aliens in an H.G. Wells novel. He's talking about War of the Worlds, and in that, basically, the Martians took over the world because we didn't know how to handle them. And very similarly, we don't know how, right now, to handle, as both a political class as well as people within the journalistic field, we don't know how to handle this concept of post-factual democracy. This has led to what I see as an extremely dangerous trend of factual relativism. A couple of days before, when I started crafting this lecture, this picture came up on Facebook. And there was a blurb below it that was arguing that people coming from different perspectives can see the same exact thing and come to a very different conclusion. However, the problem is there's context involved. One person's 6 is not automatically one person's 9, like this example gives. And the example was basically arguing, oh, we should all, understand where each other is coming from, and we should understand everybody else's point of view. But a fact is a fact. Without context, we can't figure out whether that is a 6 or a 9. But still, it is one or the other. It's not both. It can't be both. It's not Schrodinger's number. It can't be both at the same time. The problem is this is leading to things that are allowing people to see facts as being utterly ambiguous, subject to skepticism, or even worse, to be disregarded if they don't fit a narrative or any sort of emotional validation. An example I like to use, Michael Gove, who was a minister in the United Kingdom government and was for the Leave campaign running up to the vote back in June, literally said on public television in Britain, I think the British voter has had enough of experts. The implication being that the average voter doesn't want to hear what anyone has to say. They've made up their mind. Now, aside from the whole nationalistic and jingoistic sides of this argument, which is a whole other discussion, we're literally in a position where people in power are telling other people, don't listen to the facts. Listen to your emotions. Here in the States, we had a similar problem where in the run-up to the presidential election, we had a constant drone of opinion polls that told us that people thought that Hillary Clinton was corrupt and somehow was a crook. When yet, if you looked at validated statistics and actual information about her past, she had done nothing really wrong. But yet, because the narrative had been continued on, and people felt that she was somehow corrupt, she must be corrupt. I believe that this poses a very dire threat to participational democracy because it represents a systemic failure of what Jürgen Habermas argues is supposed to be a rational and disinterested public sphere. It also in some ways validates Habermas because Habermas argued that with the addition of private sphere affairs, for example, affairs such as issues around gender, around race, things around home economics, those very issues, bringing those into the public sphere was causing it to be degraded or structurally transformed. And I like to say this, he argued that basically our public sphere was degenerating from this peaceful, idealized idea of the Greek agora, where people could come and have a rational discussion with each other and talk dispassionately. It was literally resembling something more, I would like to say, like a WWE wrestling match, where people basically scream at each other and whoever can fling each other out of the ring wins. Watching any Sunday news program right now, we're faced with a media environment where rational arguments and fact-based commentary must do battle with emotion-driven baselines or alternative facts. Now, to date, in my opinion, post-factualism and alternative facts are gaining ground, and traditional journalism, those gatekeepers of the fourth estate, the mediators between the state and the private, are really in a position of needing to play catch-up. So, the main body of my talk is going to be, where does the media go from here? How does the media respond in an atmosphere where people are more interested in believing alternative facts that fit an emotional narrative, while staying true to their mission to present facts in a critical and reasonably unbiased fashion? Perhaps, in this case, alternative media fits a part of this puzzle. Now, I like this image. This went around on Facebook right around the time that the executive decided to clamp down on communications by the different executive authorities like the EPA, the National Park Service, Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, decided to put a silence gag order on them. This artist, his name's DeWitt, he's out of Minneapolis. He posted this viral. And it's one of the few times I've actually bought a piece of art. I actually bought this because he was donating all the money to the ACLU that he was earning from it. So it was like win-win. I like the image. It's grotesque, but I like it. But this brings up two very important points. Both how I found this, the fact that I found it on Facebook, and I found it as it was being virally transmitted, on one hand, and also its message. For example, the big part of this image is the nastiness to the, I guess, the left. The nastiness to the left, which is ironic, it should be the other way around. The nastiness to the left on one hand, with this very calm, cool, collected image to the right. This idea of, no, you know what, I don't have to listen to this message. And that, I think, in what is probably going to be a somewhat dark tone, to go back to what Dr. Latham was saying, a somewhat dark time for alternative media, that's the hope. The hope is in this image. The hope is that we can move past this end run and this bypass that the right wing has managed to get on our field as journalists or as students who want to become journalists or want to become citizens journalists. Alternative media still is a realm of hope and still a realm where control can be wrested. All right? And that's, I think, a very important point. So from here, I'm going to divide the lecture three ways. I'm going to give you an outline, a very brief outline, of alternative media history. I'm going to then talk a bit more about the challenges that alternative media presents to fixed media, to the more traditional media like television, radio, print. And then lastly, I want to look at possible ways forward. Alternative media challenging alternative facts. All right? So, what is alternative media? There we go. What's alternative media? In the most basic sense, alternative media is media that can be defined as simply being outside of the mainstream. As Dowling points out, if alternative media, as different forms of alternative media, have one thing in common, is that they break somebody's rules, although they rarely break all of them in every respect. And as Roger Silverstone pointed out, and Dr. Latham did in my introduction, Silverstone points out that they create new spaces for alternative voices that provide focus both for specific community interests as well as for the contrary and the subversive. All right? What's important about that is that previously we had a situation where voices that did not fit into basic mainstream media were being heard. A lot of this had to do with bandwidth. And I mean literally the case of, for example, literally physical bandwidth in the case of broadcast media up until the rise of digital communicative technology on one hand, and also the fact that you had control of the press being limited to those with financial capital. So literally there were very few channels for alternative media, for alternative voices, until the rise of a greater diversification of alternative media. Another point I wanted to raise that Atten points out is that alternative media radically reforms key aspects of communication, such as skills, capitalization, and control. Now, you might also question what makes alternative media alternative. There are really three different points that I believe make this case for alternative media being alternative. You either have a case of alternative content, a case of alternative forms of organization, or a case of alternative channels of distribution. Sometimes you can have a mix of both, or all three. All right? In the examples I'm going to show you, some of them are examples of alternative distribution. Some are going to be examples of alternative content, or subversive content in some cases. And some are literally going to be just an alternative form of hierarchical organization that allows for these voices that are otherwise marginalized to be heard. Most people, when we start talking about alternative media, think that alternative media really started in the post-World War II period. It began long before that. It was just much more limited in scope. The example that I'm going to show is a limited circulation political cartoon from early in the 19th century. Now, I looked into this one in particular a little bit. These were very small circulated lithographs. They were hand-colored. They were expensive. You had to buy them. But then you often would pass them on to others to pass a message along. This was subversive in the time, and it was very limited circulation. Only the rich, only those with a vested interest in the public sphere would be able to engage with this message. But it was alternative in that it was against, in this case, the political mainstream of the time. Now, another example, fast forwarding about 200 years, is during World War II, underground media, and then later during the Cold War, Samsat media. These form alternative media channels as well. This is also an example of distribution as well as content. In this case, the example that I have up here is a underground newspaper from Holland from during World War II. In this case, this is Orange Bulletin, but there was another one that eventually became mainstream media, which is a Dutch newspaper called Het Parool. That started as an underground press in the Amsterdam area after German occupation. But eventually, by the end of the war, all of the mainstream papers were seen as so corrupted by the war that it was these alternative media channels that stepped into the void of relevance, you might say, or of respectability or truth. They were willing to step in, and they became the mainstream after World War II. So this is also an example of what you might call citizens media. These were created at great risk. They were created in very limited quantities, and they were circulation under penalty of probably arrest. So this is the rise of citizens media. Now, Rodriguez points out that citizens media has the power of non-commercial community media as legitimate counterforce to transnational corporations such as Viacom or News Corp. But they also have a symbiotic relationship, as Atten points out. That symbiotic relationship is that they are directly related to the mainstream media. They can't exist almost without it, because what are they an alternative to if the mainstream media doesn't exist? They act as an alternative based on their content or their distribution, but they act in opposition to mainstream media. So that's another way you can look at alternative media. Now, Jenkins points out that we have convergence culture. We have emerging norms, new patterns, values, and activities that blur the boundaries between media production and media consumption. Bottom-up, consumer-driven process. And that leads me to Oz Magazine. This was something I read quite a bit on, and I looked into quite a bit while I was living in the UK, because I thought it was a very interesting case. It was a case where alternative media was going up directly against the vested interests of the British media mainstream, but they were doing it in a way that was directly challenging social and cultural norms. They were a message of counterculture. And the problem was they were doing it in a country that still had vestiges of medieval law that allowed for trial on, for example, blasphemy under one circumstance, and on another, obscenity. All right? The blasphemy in this case was a homoerotic poem about Jesus that they allowed to be printed. And yeah, I see the look. It wasn't even a good poem, to be honest with you. They were printing it simply to be provocative. And the point that they were trying to say is, we challenge the Church of England. Well, they challenged it, all right. They got hauled into court, into what's called the Old Bailey in Britain, the Central Criminal Court, the first time, and they got off on a technicality. The second time they got hauled into court, however, they were found guilty. And they were each sentenced to 6 months hard labor. Now, this is only 45 years ago, 47 years ago. 1970, that's not that long ago. So, alternative media has risks, all right? I won't say that it has the same level of risk that it did then. I mean, particularly not in Britain or in the United States. You're not going to be put in jail for what you say, but there are consequences to what alternative media is writing under certain circumstances. A newer phenomenon, along with alternative media, is this idea of culture jamming. That started to arise particularly in the late 80s, early 90s. When I was here at URI, one of the things you used to see were stickers. There was sticker art everywhere. And the one, I couldn't find a link to it, but the one that I always used to see was a caricature of Andre the Giant. And it said, Andre has a posse. And that was particularly a local one, where they were using an image of a known figure, in this case, the WWE wrestler Andre the Giant, and they were repurposing it as in this case, a graffiti message. It led to, I remember at the time, and again, I couldn't find it for this, there were some news discussions held, because it was particularly a Rhode Island phenomenon. There was some news discussions held about, what is this Andre the Giant has a posse? Is this gang activity in Rhode Island? You know, where are they going to strike next? And it led to a case of moral panic, where these stickers were subversive simply for the sake of them existing. These two examples that I've put up here, I've seen these in play. When I was doing my PhD research in Brighton, England, culture jamming was seen as a massive, massive way to sort of get a message back in a unequal sense of media penetration. In other words, if you're trying to resist a multinational corporation, if you're trying to sort of send a flippant message, shall we say, back to a corporation, how better to do it than to take the symbols of their media hegemony and use them against them. It's a way to convey a message without having the broadcast power or the broadcast gravitas to be able to really give that message back to them, if that makes sense. So you see, for example, Burger King, Murder King, with a U.S. fighter jet. By the way, a lot of this is very anti-U.S., I found. Throughout the EU, I saw this happening a lot. It was very often the equivalent of a middle finger to the United States, which as an American, I have to admit, I found a little bit disheartening, but yet I could completely understand why. The bottom one is obviously the Coke logo that's been repurposed to capitalism. Culture jamming, though, seems to be dying out a little bit in favor of something that we all know. The meme. Now, I purposely picked one that was very funny because I figured by this point in my lecture it would be a bit dark, and it seems to be. But the point is that memes take things that we all know from our culture and reappropriate them in a manner that allows us to look at memes and to understand that it's been reappropriated. The one that I used to see a lot was, and I purposely didn't use it, was the one of the character from Lord of the Rings. Which one am I thinking of, guys? Can somebody tell me?
Boromir.
Huh? Boromir. What does Boromir say? One does not simply walk into Mordor. Well, the one I used to see at the University of Sussex was one does not simply walk up Elm Grove, which was an extremely steep hill. Here at original reading, and this gets into a bit of Stuart Hall, this idea of looking at alternative readings and alternative oppositional readings, rather, to media content. That's where memes come in, and that's what makes memes so effective, as well as hilarious, to be honest. But it makes them very effective. Now, this is another example of what I was talking about alternative media as content versus alternative media versus distribution. These two examples, one of which is both here in the United States and in Britain, the other is solely in southern Britain. The first example is The Big Issue. Big Issue is a magazine that was created in Great Britain purposely for the assistance of homeless people. It was a way to give homeless people a business. What they would do is they buy these magazines for £1, and they buy them from community centers. They then can sell them for £2 to people on the street. They keep the pound, that's their profit. However, it's alternative media because its distribution completely cuts out the normal forms of distribution that the mainstream press would use. However, its content is very professional, professionally managed. It has an editorial board with full editorial control. So it's alternative, but not necessarily in the sense we've been talking about so far. On the other hand, we have Schnews. The Weekly Schnews is very specific to southern Britain, really south of the Midlands. And they cover left-wing issues, and they have both an unrestricted content as well as an alternative form of distribution. They do not have an editorial board of any sort. They work on a socialistic collaborative manner, and they distribute their information based on hoping that someone will print this out and leave it. That was how they initially did it. Now they have a web presence. But at the time, when I was at Sussex University, The way this would show up is that someone would basically abuse one of the public photocopiers. They'd print one copy and then abuse the public photocopiers. I think a lot of the faculty members used to use their photocopying privileges and print them. But as the internet became more widely available on campus, particularly via smartphones during the time that I was at Sussex, this moved to being more of a web format than a print format. They moved more towards electronic distribution, which meant that they had a wider audience but much less visibility. Their visibility declined rapidly. However, what I found that they did that was very smart is they were an early adopter of QR codes. And they placed QR codes in locations where they used to leave schnews. They put a sticker with a QR code saying, find schnews here. You could use your phone to get the QR code and to be brought right to their website. Schnews has very little professionalism to it. Very often it's full of spelling errors. It's full of graphical errors. It's full of typesetting errors. Sometimes the facts aren't accurate. But that's, in many ways, their argument, that's the trade-off. The trade-off is that they are a message for the radical left wing, and they're able to maintain a voice for people who would otherwise be voiceless. Now, a better example, other than schnews, is indie media. Indie media is now approaching about 17 years old. But when indie media first started, it was based out of protests around the WTO meetings in Seattle, Washington, back, I believe, in '99. Indie media embodies some of the elements of schnews, as in a left-wing potential, but they also embody this sense of professionalism. They do have an editorial board, but it's decentralized. They try to emulate professional norms with alternative content. The main thing that separates them from things like schnews is the fact that if you were to watch an indie media webcast, or if you read an indie media article that's published, it will look very polished. Now, an example I didn't want to put up here of another example of alternative media that is extremely polished is some of the output coming out of the Islamic State. If you look at some of the articles and some of the web magazines that are coming out of the Islamic State, they are as professional, they look as professional and as sharp as a publication from any corporation in any country. And it's kind of disturbing because the message is radical right-wing, or in this case, fundamentalist. But it looks like it could be an insert into the New York Times. So indie media, to go back, utilizes that ideal. They are trying to be a parallel to the news services that we have to provide a left-wing perspective. The important thing that I want to make clear, though, is that all of these services that I've noted are moving away and adapting away from the use of print media. They're moving away also from a sense of physicality. They're moving towards a virtual presence. Now, we've talked about some of them. We've talked about YouTube. We have our president who's on Twitter, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. We have Periscope, which is a way of sending videos briefly that I'm sure you guys know about. We have Facebook and Facebook Live. I'm on Facebook Live right now. This is being put out on my Facebook page. We also have services like Snapchat, which while, I could put a puppy face on myself with Snapchat, I can also use it to send messages that would otherwise not get out. So, that brings us up to the present, and it's a very basic overview of alternative media. Very basic. What I'd like to discuss, though, about this is whether or not these digital communicative technologies that we're looking at are they an alternative in and of themselves? are we really seeing these technologies as mature? Are we seeing these technologies as a mature technology